Good evening, comrades, and welcome to tonight's Labour Left Alliance education session. I'm very pleased to welcome tonight Bob Allen, who's going to speak on the London recruits. And this is a talk, it's in connection with the book as well, which I'm sure Bob will mention, about a group of socialists and communists who went from London, I think other parts of the country as well, but they were known collectively as the London recruits, and they went to fight with the ANC in South Africa against apartheid. Now, we're all, I think, very familiar with the struggles against apartheid, but I have to confess that this was one particular aspect of it which I didn't really know very much at all. So I'm really looking forward to Bob's talk. I also know that we've got a couple of people on the call who were actually members of this group. So I think will prove to be a very interesting talk. The usual format will be that we'll have Bob's talk for around about 40 to 45 minutes, and that will then be followed by questions and then comments as well. Comrades can then come in and ask questions. Can I ask you please to use the raise hand button if you want to come in and ask a question. You can also use the question and answer function as well if you've got technical problems in speaking or indeed appearing on camera. The chat box, which I know a lot of people like to use, is a little more difficult to follow, particularly for the chair and for the people who are doing the
start video
work here. So I would be grateful if you could just use the ask question format or the raise hand format. Okay, so I'm now going to hand over to Bob, and he's going to do the talk on the London recruits.
I think Bob's having a bit of trouble with his technology. Bob, I'm asking you to unmute and switch on your camera. Just click on the button that you can see.
I'm now unmuted, but my camera keeps coming and going. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to tell you a very important story from decades ago. As feminists always argue, the personal is political. Well, this story is certainly personal, and it's certainly political. This is not an exercise in nostalgia, but important history with a great deal of relevance to the present day. The London Recruits' Secret War Against Apartheid, edited by Ken Keeble and shortly to be made into a documentary film, describes the brave deeds of real-life heroes, many of whom I'm proud to know as lifelong friends. This is their story. During the 20th century, there were perhaps two struggles that over time won almost universal support. Firstly, that rare thing, the just war, namely the Second World War against fascism and Nazism, and secondly, the just struggle against the brutal racist apartheid regime in South Africa. From the late 1960s onwards, our London recruits bravely carried out secret missions for the African National Congress, and some of them are in the picture there. Ronnie Casrill's, our commander, is the one on the left. George Bridges, a recruiter. Dennis Walsh in the background, one of the London recruits. Ken Keeble, the brave first London recruit, and yours truly. I became immersed in radical revolutionary politics from a very early age, thanks to my dad's influence, who was a lifelong trade unionist and communist, and taught us to believe that when you struggle for justice, sometimes you win, sometimes you don't. but if you stand on the sidelines, you lose. The London recruits didn't stand on the sidelines. They chose to step forward. When in 1969, I became the London District Secretary full-time for the party's youth organization, the Young Communist League, I hadn't realized that I had an unofficial element to my job. And that was to, on behalf of the movement, to recruit volunteers to go on missions to South Africa in support of the then illegal African National Congress, South African Communist Party, and the trade union movement, who were in a triple alliance of struggle. So, who were these London recruits? What was the nature of the struggle they were part of? And what was the wider context, and how did they fit into it? And importantly, are there lessons for us today? So without attempting a detailed history, here's my take on all of that. As a result of victory in World War II, major advances were achieved for working people. However, the world became increasingly bipolar during the Cold War, and that had a direct bearing on South Africa. It was seen by the powers that be in the West as a bulwark against communism and the source of huge profits, particularly from mining. To use a post-Watergate phrase, if in doubt, follow the money. This was especially true for British big business, which invested heavily in South Africa. Small wonder that Maggie Thatcher described Mandela as a terrorist and apartheid South Africa as an ally. The apartheid regime grew directly out of hundreds of years of British and Dutch colonial rule and exploitation, with various acts embedding exclusive white power. Following the 1948 election for whites only, and those laws entrenched their power, population was forcibly divided into 4 groups: white, colored, Indian, and African, with no rights, leaving whites, 10% of the population, in sole control of the state and people's daily lives. The South African Republic was declared in May '61. Through the Population Registration Act, Group Areas Act, Prohibition of Marriages Act, creation of so-called homelands, and Bantu education, the hated pass laws, where you had to, if you were a non-white, carry a passbook to show that you were actually in an area you were allowed to be. For the great majority of South Africans, they were condemned to live in fragmented and poorer areas, increased poverty and unemployment, grossly inferior education, public segregation in all places. The list goes on. Made worse by mass removals from their hometowns. Between 1960 and 83 alone, 3.5 million were forcibly moved. This was enforced by a large and powerful police force and army, and by 1978, apartheid South Africa was spending over 20% of its annual budget on so-called defense. In the 50s and 60s, the African National Congress developed a new and more determined leadership under Oliver Tambo, Nelson Mandela, and co. It created a wide umbrella of opposition, which eventually launched its definitive Freedom Charter in 1955. There were many acts of passive resistance, street protests, petitions, strikes, burning of passbooks, and so on. For instance, in August '56, over 20,000 women protested outside the Union Buildings Parliament in Pretoria against the extension of past laws to women. And then came the ridiculously long treason trial of 156 ANC leaders arrested for supposed high treason, all eventually acquitted. And then in 1960 was the game changer. It was the infamous massacre on March the 21st, 1960, of peaceful protesters against the past laws in Sharpeville. Nearly 70 dead and 200 wounded. This was followed by the capture of Madiba when traveling in a car in disguise to a meeting. And then in July 63, probably following a tip-off by a collaborator, came the capture of 17 ANC leaders meeting secretly, as they periodically did, at Liliesleaf Farm, Rivonia. They were developing the new ANC strategy, including armed struggle, through MK, Umkhonto Sizwe, Spear of the Nation. They included Walter Sisulu, Governor Mbeki, Ahmed Kathadra, Dennis Goldberg, Andrew Mlangeni, Elias Motsoaledi, Raymond Ladba, and Mac Maharaj. Later, most of them would serve alongside Mandela in government post-94. However, in 1963, the police and army gloated that they'd set back the resistance of the ANC and its allies by a generation. They were wrong, but for a while, the movement was brutally suppressed. And if you look at the following pictures, you'll see how they did that. First of all, the solitary confinement cells, if we could see those, please. Or do I need to? Yeah. And similarly, below, next pictures, where there was mass hangings of people who resisted. There's more of the solitary confinement cells. I personally stood inside one for a few minutes, and that, to be frank, was enough. And of course, before that, you'll see one of the military vehicles that the paramilitary police used to suppress black towns, a Casper, which they would send in and raid and brutalize the local community. Below that, you'll see a picture of Nelson Mandela and Ronnie Casrills. And Ronnie, supposedly a student at LSE in London for a number of years, when he was sent into exile, and along with others, organized the resistance from abroad. And he was our commander in terms of the recruits going to South Africa. Fortunately, not all the leaders were caught. And so the ANC General Secretary, Oliver Tambo, Bram Fisher, the Communist and Afrikaner lawyer, Winnie Mandela, Joe Slovo, Ruth First, the heroic freedom fighter in her own right, the wife of Joe Slovo, and of course, Ronnie Casrills, Albertina Sisulu, and others. And then came, in 1976, another crucial and terrible event. On the 16th of June, there was a mass youth uprising in the local schools, particularly in Soweto, against the imposition of Afrikaans language in the African schools, because of course education, like everything else, was segregated. And the subsequent slaughter of hundreds. mainly children and young people, killed by the police and army, many shot in the back, over 575, of which 494 were black. And the picture you'll see later on of Oscar Peterson, you'll see one of the young black lads who was killed. Yeah, there it is. And it speaks for itself. And so, as a result of this pivotal event, as well as international solidarity campaigns like the anti-apartheid movement in Britain, a secret army of resistance, MK, Spear of the Nation, was developed alongside the mass movement of the African National Congress. Underground networks were established, and international solidarity took on a new form: the London recruits. The ANC's very reluctant turn to armed resistance was in direct response to the regime's militarization of South Africa and their suppression of all forms of legitimate protest or basic human rights. As ANC President Chief Albert Lutuli said, "No one can blame brave and just men and women for seeking justice by the use of violent methods, nor could they be blamed if they tried to create an organized force in order to ultimately establish peace and racial harmony." Thousands left South Africa to train abroad in Tanzania, Angola, and so on, and Mozambique, because they became supportive frontline states following their liberation from Portuguese colonial rule after the 1975 Carnation Revolution in Portugal. We saw the emergence of the Black Consciousness movement led by Steve Biko. And as the economy briefly grew, came the rise of Black trade unions, who initiated, particularly in the 1970s, a wave of strikes against low pay and oppressive working conditions, especially in mining. And so this is the context in the late 60s through the 70s and 80s, but particularly in the 70s. This is the context for the London recruits. Now, they would all want me to say, despite their personal bravery, that throughout the long and bitter decades of struggle, the overwhelming burden of suffering and sacrifice fell on the millions of Black women and men in South Africa's townships, particularly Soweto, the cradle of the revolution. And I suppose the nearly 2 million people who now live in Soweto, I suppose the previous residents would agree with Dolores Ibarruri, heroic member of Republican Spain's parliament when resisting General Franco's fascist coup in 1936. She declared, "Better to die on your feet than live on your knees." However, the impact of apartheid's killing, mass arrests, torture, bannings, imprisonment of leaders on Robben Island meant the movement within South Africa in the late 60s, early 70s was largely silenced. And during that very difficult period, the London recruits played a significant part in the fight back. And I just want you to look at the pictures of Robben Island and the prison on Robben Island. Because from afar, Robben Island looks almost benign. And then when you look at the pictures of the prison, that's the entrance. These are the blocks, prison blocks. And then below, the next is this particular cell happened to be Nelson Mandela's cell, but they're all small solitary cells with a blanket on the floor, very basic. And they were forced to do hard labor in the quarry, and that was their life, day after day, year after year. Nothing could be more brutal, but they were not crushed. So, who were these London recruits who were trying to offer their assistance? Well, simply put, they were a network of young, idealistic internationalists who willingly stepped into the breach at the request of the exiled ANC and SACP leaders. They had nothing, absolutely nothing to gain, and potentially everything to lose. Volunteering to go to South Africa. They were very young, mostly early 20s, women and men, mainly young workers and some students, some from different backgrounds and a variety of political formations on the left. They were all white. Why? Because they used the color of their skin as a disguise. After all, who would suspect white tourists going to South Africa to enjoy the sun and scenery? Who would expect them to be wanting to undermine the regime, using racism against itself? These volunteers, or smugglers, as Ronnie often called them, necessarily operated in complete secrecy in self-contained units, unaware of each other's existence. Their job was to smuggle in propaganda leaflets, set up ANC street broadcasts using the bucket bombs, and I'll talk about that wonderful technology in a moment. And later on, some even transported and stored weapons for the MK. The impact of their activities, both within and outside South Africa, was enormous, although I don't think we fully realized this at the time. Just to briefly skip back, in the next set of photographs, you'll see the memorial to those brave children and young people who died in '76. And that's the memorial in Soweto. And one of the veterans of the leadership I fortunately met on the day we went to join in the commemoration, it was Ahmed Kathadra, extraordinary man. And next, was it on the night before the commemoration day, children and young people gather in community centres and halls around the country and have a vigil, a candlelit vigil to mark the annual commemoration. And the next picture shows the plaque dedicated to those who fell. Okay, you should see pictures now. That's Hector Peterson. You should be, yes. So this would be ANC militants, MK combatants, Ronnie in the middle, in uniform with their full kit, and there were many of these heroic fighters involved in the struggle. And below, next is a picture of Ronnie and his wife Eleanor Casseros, who was a heroic fighter in her own right, as many women were. I want now to describe this wonderful technology that our brave volunteers deployed. First of all, the bucket bomb, as we call it. And of course, the little device at the bottom could be secreted in the special suitcases. I'll talk about those in a moment. But of course, you could buy a bucket from a hardware store. And so the smuggled in leaflets were placed in such a bucket, and the timer set and arranged, and a lid, and that would then be placed in a public square or by a railway station where black workers would come in to the town to work, and other suitable locations. The timer would be set. Our volunteers would then recede into the background. Poof! The lid would come off. The leaflets would be thrown tens of feet into the air. And of course, these would be ANC leaflets saying the ANC is still alive and fighting, and so on. Just to go next to the, this is Tom Bell, one of the volunteers who went out there with his brother Ron. They like to refer to themselves as the fabulous Bell brothers. I can't imagine why, but there we go. And this is one of the suitcases with the secret compartment in the bottom, a pattern that throws the eyes, so you wouldn't know it was there. And underneath would be the leaflets and some of the kit needed for the buckets. And ditto in the next picture, Dennis Walsh, another one of the recruits at a meeting in South Africa itself. Tom's meeting happened to be in the House of Commons in London. There's Ronnie hosting the meeting, and Dennis explaining about his mission, and that was his your common or garden suitcase with the secret compartment. And our volunteers took in dozens of these suitcases for their missions. And so, whilst this was going on, of course, the African National Congress, the South African Communist Party, the trade unions were rebuilding their structures and networks, and MK, the underground resistance army, became a serious force. And if we move on in terms of the pictures, you'll see, this was a fantastic moment when we met Kgalema Motlanthe, then the deputy president of South Africa in the days of freedom, with Ronnie in the background, and there would be a number of London recruits. On the right, that's Stewart Round, who was involved in Africa Hinterland. I'll come to that in a moment, but that was a serious contribution to the struggle with these so-called safari trips, bringing in important military kit for MK. Bob Newland, one of the brave volunteers, Ronnie in the background, the deputy president in the middle, Dennis Walsh in the background, and obviously Ken Keeble, and then George and I, who were the backroom boys helping to recruit volunteers. Of course, protests were starting to escalate across the world, including the anti-apartheid movement in Britain, and the Stop the Tour campaign led by Peter Hain. The liberated frontline states offered pivotal support, as did socialist countries, particularly Cuba and the Soviet Union. Now, you may find this hard to believe, but as this was all done in a highly secret way, we didn't know, apart from immediate contacts, the network of people that was actually involved overall, and that was out of necessity. And if you look at the next pictures of, this is Lillesley Farm, it's now restored, and we go to the next picture, and that's a memorial. As you walk through, that's a memorial to the fallen, and those stones represent the fallen. And many, many died in this struggle. Of course, if we go to the next couple of pictures, I just wanted to refer briefly to the Africa safari truck and the next picture, because it was a very important contribution to the struggle, as I mentioned. And another couple of important players, there's Mary Chamblin, stood next to Stewart on the right, and towards the left, the other side of me, Norman Lucas, brave contributors to our collective efforts. Mary had a marriage of convenience so that she and her husband could go to South Africa to live, and obviously took everything lock, stock and barrel. But in the 20-odd cases was an enormous amount of kit for the African National Congress. Very important. Norman, on the other hand, was this suave photographer on the cruise ship going to South Africa. I jest, because it was actually very serious what he was doing. And he also was one of our brave volunteers. Moving on, this is registered, this history, in a special exhibition that's been developed at Lily's Leaf Farm. And if anybody goes to South Africa, I recommend you go to Lily's Leaf in Rivonia and see this excellent exhibition. And the next one, next photograph, that's an illustration of the effectiveness of MK. These were electricity pylons that they sabotaged on one of their missions. And moving on to the next, this is Rika Hobson, who, as you can see now, is a more mature lady and disabled, but again, a brave heroine of the struggle. And there were so many like her, escorted by Tom and the GDR ambassador. And the next, and in the exhibition, of course, there's examples of what the London recruits got up to, and some of our suitcases proudly on display. And then there's some history of the individual volunteers. So there's Tom, and this is the Rand Daily Mail. And what happened was each team, unaware of each other, because operating in secrecy, set off simultaneously a series of bucket bombs in different towns, Cape Town, Durban, Soweto, Joburg, and so on. And it had an enormous impact within South Africa. And Tom is obviously enjoying himself telling the story, and quite rightly too. And then the next few pictures, we've got Ken, one of the first volunteers, then Mary, then the Fabulous Bell Brothers, and so on. And moving on to Ron, he is addressing, next picture, he's addressing some of the MK veterans obviously in days of democracy, and illustrating the contribution within that talk of the London recruits. If we go to the next set of pictures, it'll be relevant in a moment. Oh yes, this for me was a very, very special moment. This is outside the Helmsley Hotel. Tom was absolutely committed to finding this hotel that he stayed in the days of apartheid South Africa, when he was carrying out his mission. And after much searching, he eventually found it, he then went in and mentioned his story to the staff, who were dumbfounded. But that was really cool. And going on to the next, you'll recognize that particular building. And within the House of Commons, of course, we had one of a number of reunion meetings. This one was hosted by Peter Hain, who said with some relish, when he looked around at the London recruits, this is probably the largest gathering of subversives that this part of the Westminster Palace has ever hosted. Ronnie on one side and Ken on the other. And in attendance, of course, were a number of the miscreants, otherwise known as the London recruits. If we go to the next set of pictures, I want to mention Sean in particular, because unfortunately, on his second mission, he walked into a trap, was captured, imprisoned in solitary confinement, was brutally treated. But after 5 years, he came out, and of course, he didn't tell him anything. Just to his left is Steve Marsden, another one of the, on the left-hand side, another one of the brave volunteers. The next picture is of Mary and one or two of the others involved in the struggle, and she's telling her story, and she certainly tells the story very well, and is a brave woman and a very fine intellectual and writer. I recommend her books to anybody. Mary Chamblin. Next, we met Bob Stewart, veteran anti-apartheid activist, and there's a number of us gathered, and one or two that I haven't mentioned. Behind Tom in the middle, that's Dennis Walsh. And by the way, Graham White, he and Dennis Walsh, when on their mission, experienced one of those unanticipated events, a real heart stopper. They're in the hotel room, and many of these comrades, by the way, had never been on a plane before, let alone stayed in a hotel. And of course, there it was, the middle of the day, they were sorting out their leaflets and buckets, everything was spread out on the beds. A key turns in the lock of the door, and in walks the hotel maid, who of course is black, because of course any such work, not that I'm saying being a hotel maid is not an important job, it is, but obviously only black people tended to be employed as hotel maid. She was astonished, and there was a frozen silence. She turned on her heels and left. Dennis and Graham then desperately had to think very quickly on their feet, rushed and encouraged her to come back into the room, sat her down, showed her one of the leaflets, bit the bullet, and explained what they were doing. And crossing fingers and toes, she looked up and said to them, "So you've come here to help us?" And the question indicated to Dennis and Graham that she'd be okay. So she then, and they said, yes, well, that's the idea. Is that okay? She nodded, stuffed the leaflet in her pinny, and quietly left. What more can I say? And on the far left, there's Bob Newland again and Pete Smith, both involved in missions, and Pete for a very lengthy period of time bravely within the country. So moving on, as an illustration of the results, and I'll come to them because they're mixed, as a result of political liberation, we have not only universal suffrage and civil rights for everybody in South Africa, but there's a proper Supreme Court to decide on matters of law and people's rights. And ditto, the next picture shows you the outside of this very impressive and important constitutional instrument. Below that, and next, is a picture of Cape Town Town Hall, and I've included that because from that position, high in the building, was Mandela's first real speech to the public as a free man in relation to the forthcoming 94 democratic elections. And talking of which, if we look at the next two pictures, this, by the way, is the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund that we visited, because all the profits from our book goes to that children's fund. And the next picture illustrates the connection with children and young people. This is Madiba's old school. Nelson Mandela, his clan name is Madiba. That's why I was using that. But anyway, this is his old school on election day. And we went in to see how it operated. And you can see Bob just about to go in. Okay. I just want to, in conclusion, in terms of my remarks, make reference to both the historical past, but more to do with as well the here and now, and the relevance of this struggle to the here and now, both in terms of South Africa and the wider world. The political liberation from the apartheid regime was the latter stage of a very, very long struggle for freedom, and going back decades. Tough, protracted negotiations between the ANC and the regime, Mandela's release, the triple alliance of the African National Congress, the South African Communist Party, and the South African Congress of Trade Unions, the core of the resistance, were all unbanned and became legal. Eventually, we were able to bring to an end the regime's use of a third force that was seeking to promote black on black violence and division in the community. And a large number of people, sadly, did get killed. There was the rise of the violent white right and its ultimate demise. Free elections in 1994 brought freedom to the people of South Africa, as advocated in their famous Freedom Charter. Universal suffrage, civil rights, Supreme Court, expansion of social housing, etc., etc. However, a great deal of work is yet to be done. And there's a big difference between political liberation and economic liberation, and that has yet to be achieved. For the majority of the people of South Africa, there are enormous ongoing challenges, particularly for the Black majority in terms of poverty and unemployment, inequality, AIDS, crime and corruption. And in regards to corruption, of course, what happened particularly following Mandela and Mbeki's governments, in the case of the presidency of Jacob Zuma, corruption became and continues to be a significant undermining of the struggle. And of course, we mustn't forget that in 2012, in a free South Africa, there was the tragic loss of life at the Lonmin platinum mine in Marikana during an industrial dispute when several dozen were killed. That has put a big strain on the alliance. It's meant that the ANC vote has fallen from 2/3 to just over 50%, and unemployment remains very, very high, at about 30%. But amongst young people, it's often double that. There are problems of inequality and poor delivery of service, and the weight of colonial history and the distortions on South African society still pertain today. Progress can be stepped up, but only through struggle, whether that's in South Africa or else where. I want to humbly suggest that the high moral values of internationalism, solidarity, freedom and justice through collective action as represented by the London recruits stands in stark contrast to imperialist adventures old and new. These brave women and men offered a positive alternative to apartheid and to its companion that's causing so much inequality and injustice in the world today, neo-liberalism.
Sorry.
Hello? Am I still?
Sorry. Yeah, you're still there.
Okay, okay. I hope I'm okay on time still, Tina.
Yeah, but it would be good if you could wind up soon, I think.
I'll be finished in 5 minutes. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. I'll be chairing the question. And
Sorry. Okay, Kevin. Sorry, I spoke to the right. Okay, just in conclusion, Mandela always argued that love is a natural feeling and hate is learnt. I remember Che Guevara saying that the primary motive of a true revolutionary was love. And when it comes to life, is it something an individual can buy, or is it something we can collectively create? The poison chalice of so-called aspiration needs to be amended, because I aspire to be in a safer, more equal, just, greener and happier world. That world is possible. And I think the London recruits illustrated in their small way how you bring that about. When we look around at the refugees from war and hunger, the Black Lives Matter movement, the struggle against racism and inequality, whether that be in America, here or elsewhere, continues, and we have to play our full part. In trying to play our full part, I hope we can be inspired by the London recruits. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. And that was a very interesting talk. Again, I learned a lot from it about a topic which I hardly knew at all. I just would like now to invite people to ask questions and make contributions. What I would suggest is that we take 3 or 4 of the questions and contributions, and then Bob can come in. So the first one is Steve O'Neill. Okay, Steve, if you'd like to come in now. Steve O'Neill.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now, Steve. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just have a real short, simple question. What happened to the Freedom Charter?
Okay.
That's it.
Okay. This is a question that's coming on the question and answer panel, Bob.
Yeah.
And it's John Beeching. And he says, were there recruits from other European or countries and America? Okay. Okay. Faraz, if you'd like to come in now and ask your question.
I just wondered, because of the happenings in the Labour Party and Keith getting in to power by false pretenses, operating as Stalinism, is there a manual that might be useful for Labour in exile? That's all I wanted to ask.
Okay, thanks, Faraz. Andy Wynne, next comrade.
Thank you. I mean, obviously that was a very inspiring speech. And I think it's important to realise that it's an argument against nationalism, that there are socialists and other comrades across the world who have risked their lives and in many cases given their lives. I mean, other examples perhaps are the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, where many young, again, socialists from Britain went and fought on the side of the Republicans. I think also in terms of Algeria, there were a number of French people who contributed significantly to the struggle in Algeria. And I think, I mean, still today that there are, I mean, perhaps not so many, but there are still a number of people, like white people, people from Britain and other countries who are working very hard with comrades across Africa to achieve the economic liberation that the speaker spoke about. So we've got the political liberation, but we've still got a huge way to go in terms of the economic liberation, which in many ways has gone backwards since the end of apartheid. So, you know, I think South Africa and many other African countries are now a lot more unequal than they were a few decades ago. So the struggle very definitely continues. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Andy. And then Steve Marsling, please.
Yes, first of all, can I say very congratulations to Bob, very comprehensive history of what happened and what we did. I was one of the London recruits, and in fact, I was recruited by Bob Allen, who then sent me off to meet Ronnie Casrals. A couple of things that I would like to highlight after that excellent presentation by Bob is that a number of our recruits, including Bob, which I coordinated, have put forward a teacher's pack, a teacher pupil pack, which is, it has some case studies in it, it has photos from the anti-apartheid archive, it has videos, it has clips from the fabulous film that's coming out this year, and it also has the history of the Soweto uprising, Sharpeville, and other laws, apartheid laws, and a brief history. This will be going into every school that requests it from September. And so the legacy of the London Recruits, it's called London Recruits and the Struggle Against Apartheid, will go on for years and years and years. And of course, as Bob alluded to, there will be a film coming out which has some people playing us, some younger people playing us. I happen to have a very, very handsome young man playing me, as you'd expect. And but there's also us as well. And we're going, you know, that film will be finished by the end of the year, will be shown by the end of the year, we hope, and beginning of next, and it will go all over the world. So we live on, hopefully. And once again, really just to say to Bob, thank you very much. It was people like Bob that changed my life. I chance meeting in a pub. I weren't very, you know, I was political, but didn't know in what direction I was going in. And quite honestly, I've met some of the most wonderful people that I could possibly meet, both in the Young Communist League then and now, and in the Labour Party then and now. And it changed my life. So yes, I made a contribution, but the movement, the world socialist and communist political movement, made an even bigger impression on my own life. And I thank each and every one of the people that I've met in the political movements of both the Labour Party and the Communist Party, because, you know, they made me, I'm sure, a much better person than I would have been, because I was a bit of a villain beforehand. So I just wanted to make that contribution. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve. And then Ken Keeble.
Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. Wonderful talk there by Bob Allen. Thank you for that. And Bob gets quite emotional about it, and quite rightly so. I think that's not at all an unreasonable reaction. I'll try and talk about some of the questions that came up. On the Freedom Charter, I think that's a work in progress. And you'll need to talk to South Africans about that, not about British people who are in solidarity with the struggle. On the question of were there Americans involved, I think there were 4 Americans, 4 Irish people, 1 French woman, 1 Greek Australian, and another Greek. I think that covers them all. Okay, the rest of them were British. We just recently discovered another one, because we're still finding people that they've all kept quiet about it all their lives, and only, you know, since the book was published, some people are appearing that we didn't know about before. One of them is Ramila Patel, who's not qualified for the whiteness test. She's a British one of the Uganda nation community who came to live in Britain, and she was in the International Socialists in the mid-1980s, and then she went with her partner, and they kept a safe house in Botswana, close to the South African border, for about 3 years. Very, very dangerous thing to do, and very courageous. I'm still waiting for her to write her story. Actually, we just mentioned our website, because they've got a lot of wonderful material on the website. londonrecruits.org.uk. londonrecruits.org.uk. We got stories from people who hadn't been discovered when the book was published. They're people who were discovered since, and they're all interesting. They're all very, very interesting, and they're interesting in themselves, but they're also a bit of a picture as to the ideas that were going around on the left, among young people on the left in Britain in the 60s and 70s. I think Bob said I was the first, but I thought I heard him say that, but that's not quite correct. I went on my first mission in 1968 when I was 23 years old, but the first ones went the previous year.
Yes. Yes.
That's it. There was 6 of them, I think, went in 1967. They were the first. What else did I want to say? Yeah, I never tire of telling the story of the London Recruits, because I think it has the power to inspire people, especially young people, to fight for a better world. And I think Bob said something like that as well. That's why I think it's very, very important. Why I think this school's education pack is important. The film will be important when it eventually comes out. I don't know how widely it will be distributed in this country. That remains to be seen, because I think there will be some opposition to it. But anyway, it's well in hand and nearly finished. I think that's everything. I can ask questions. I can answer questions, of course. But Bob did mention that all the royalties from the book go to the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund, so I don't make any money out of it. That's it. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Ken. And I'm sure I'll bring you back in again if anybody wants some more detailed questions. Bob, would you like to come back in and respond to some of the comments?
Briefly, because questions and comments from others are more important than me wittering on. But I just want to say a couple of things. First of all, Ken's right. The Freedom Charter is a work in progress. It's still there. It's an important backdrop, or should be an important backdrop, for everything that the movement and the government do in South Africa. And there's much yet to be done. And linked to that, there's also the question of political education, because as anybody on the left will know, unless we take responsibility for our own history and keeping it alive and telling others, it will wither on the vine. And a lot of the born frees, young South Africans who've not known apartheid, the political education amongst them there's a very mixed picture, and that needs to be improved. In terms of the recruits, yes, there were, and Ken, thank you for updating everybody on that. there were recruits from a number of countries. And I think, but I may be wrong, I thought there was 1 or 2 from Holland, but maybe I've got that wrong. But the reason why the book and the forthcoming film is called London Recruits, 2 reasons really. One, the exile leadership group of the underground movement was based in London with Ronnie Casrills, Azid Pahad, Ron Press, and there's somebody else whose name I've sadly forgotten. They were based in London, a group of them, and they designed the bucket bomb and so on, and planned on behalf of the ANC the interventions of the London recruits. So that's why. But so I wouldn't want you to think I was undervaluing the contribution of recruits from elsewhere. In terms of a reference to current intrigues within the Labour Party following the sad demise of Corbyn's leadership, I don't want to say too much specifically on that, but what I do want to say is this, that whether you're operating quite legitimately as a member of the Labour Party or another political party or no political party, I think the guiding principles of the struggle to end apartheid apply. This is about developing alliances, honest politics, being clear about what your objective is and working to get a united front to deliver that objective. There's no shortcut. There's no short circuit. It's like trade union organizing. You don't get the boss to listen to what you've got to say by nice words. You have to organize on the ground and have some weight. So I think those, and I think it's very important as well that we keep a, and this is going to sound a bit pious, but that we continue to have a moral, ethical stand, that we operate in an ethical and morally sound way. And that's why we need to resist the temptations of corruption and wheeling and dealing and all of that, because of course that is so damaging. I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Are there any further questions, comrades, at all? Just transfer someone over, sorry. Okay, Stan Keeble, if you'd like to come in, please.
Yeah, it was interesting to hear that, stuff. I thought there's one or two things. I think the chairman made a mistake in the introduction because he hadn't heard the story yet. That's Kevin saying that, because you said that people had gone there, London recruits had gone there to fight, I think. And of course, it wasn't that, was it? It was gone there to let off leaflet bombs and recordings and ANC songs and stuff like that. Yeah, it was a very heroic thing because they're all at great risk, of course. A scary thing to do, isn't it? To go into apartheid South Africa as most of them are some kind of communist. And I thought when Ken decided to write his piece, you know, he thought, well, this is before, I don't know what the first meeting was, 2005, I think, when the recruits got together. But before that, he was on his own and didn't know and didn't want to take the secret of what had happened, take his story to the grave. You know, he better write it down. And that became one chapter of the book, because then he contacted other people. So I thought that was interesting, the fact that they've been all keeping it so secret, didn't know each other. And in fact, it turned out that Ronnie had been recruiting people from the Young Communist League, which is where me and Ken were at the time, and also from the International Socialists, what became SWP. I think it was called International Socialists then, wasn't it? In the 70s, early 70s, I remember you know, I come across them a lot in trade union work and that. But we had no idea, and Ken had no idea, that there were those different political tendencies. So I mean, when people went as recruits and responded to Ronnie's invitation, if you like, through the London YCL, when they said either I'm sure the International Socialist Comrades as well as the YCLers would have seen it at that time as part of the worldwide struggle for socialism. Okay. You may remember, the older comrades will remember, there were supposed to be 3 strands that were winning. You know, there was the socialist bloc, there was the national liberation movements, and there was the working class in the capitalist countries. That was the sort of theory, and that was all going forward. You know, the frontline states were getting closer to apartheid, and apartheid was losing. But it turns out, of course, that capitalism don't mind whether it's racist or whether it's not, doesn't it? One of the things I think Bob was talking about corruption in the South African government now, long after apartheid, you know, Zuma's government, yes, but I mean the fact is that corruption is endemic to capitalism, isn't it? No matter where you are. So the racism gets in the way and confuses the situation. It makes it more difficult to see the class struggle, doesn't it? It's hidden when there's a racist system like that. It obscures the fact that it's a class struggle that's behind it, and that's now, of course, out in the open. As for the charter, what was it called? The Freedom Charter. I remember that. Freedom Charter. I don't think it's a work in progress, as Ken and Bob both said. You know, I think it's a work in regression, isn't it? There's no way that as things becoming closer, that they're gradually going down the road. I know that's what the South African Communist Party says, actually. If you read this stuff, they're, you know, no matter how bad things go backwards, they still say, oh, this is a move in the direction of liberation. But it's not true, is it? It's a capitalist country in a capitalist world, and it's part of the pecking order, you know, and then you can see. Yeah, endemic. But the funny thing is that although corruption is endemic to capitalism, racism isn't. You know, and it's actually the case, isn't it, that the ruling class in South Africa that's now mixed race, certainly a lot of whites involved, but you can be black and become fully member of the establishment now. But they can manage to exploit the working class very well, and it's amazing, isn't it? The comparison between Sharpeville in 1961 that triggered the armed struggle. The ANC used that and said, we decided to go for the armed struggle then. And then the Marikana massacre in an ANC, you know, with an ANC government. So it tells you that we've got a long way to go, as you say. But just going back to the recruits, I mean, I mentioned the political ones, but it is a remarkable truth, isn't it? That if you went in the optimistic times of the 60s and early 70s, for the workers' movement, for socialist movement, all that, if you went to the ordinary working people in Britain and asked them, you know, will you go on a mission to liberate South Africa? And don't forget, the government here was racist and pro-apartheid at the time. You know, you go to them and say that a sufficient number of individuals who are not political would actually go for that and volunteer. So, you know, that tells you the nature of that. How the public opinion at that time would have supported that. So people would have think, well, I'll do the right thing. And that's what Steve talked about, wasn't it? I think a few minutes ago, that he wasn't politically organised and nevertheless volunteered. So good. Thank you.
Okay, Stan, Jerry Downing.
All right, okay. Well, I do have to say I substantially agree with Stan on the observations that he's made there. The Freedom Charter is essentially a two-stage theory of revolution. First, we'll get rid of the apartheid system, and then we'll have the socialist revolution at some time in the indefinite future. But in fact, it means for the South African Communist Party and the ANC and COSATU, it meant never. We only have to cite the fate of the presidents of South Africa. When Nelson Mandela left Robben Island, he didn't have 2 cents to rub together. By the time he died, there was much speculation about what he was worth before he died, but by the time he died, he was worth $3.2 million. Not a bad advance. Well, where did the money come from? Well, 2 years after the first democratic election in 94 and 96, he accepted the GEAR, which was the IMF's austerity program. And the GEAR was the IMF ruling South Africa with the assistance of Nelson Mandela. Of course, the next president was Mbeki. Mbeki turned out was worth $10 million. Well done, Mbeki. And then the horribly corrupt Zuma was worth $20 million. Now we're going in the right direction now, aren't they? But see how horribly corrupt Zuma was, and he was ousted by Ramaphosa. Now Ramaphosa, of course, was the absolutely uncorrupt man who was worth $500 million. Now, where did he get the $500 million? Because the capitalist class in South Africa bunged him and bunged him and bunged him, and he took it all. Oh, and by the way, he did have a brother-in-law married to his sister, and the brother-in-law was worth $1.5 billion. Now there's real socialism and liberation. Of course, the real situation for the black masses in South Africa, they are worse off now than they were under apartheid. They are poorer and more exploited. If you look at the life statistics, the life expectancy, if you look at the child mortality rate, if you look at all those statistics for the black masses in South Africa, they're as bad, if not worse, than all of Africa, all of the most oppressed nation in Africa, and all of Southeast Asia. They're shocking statistic. Well done, Nelson Mandela, for liberating us from apartheid, and you got your statue in Parliament Square, along with other people like Mahatma Gandhi, who had served British imperialism. That's why you get your statue there. They haven't put the Jerry Adams statue there yet, but he might make it at some point. Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry. There are no other comrades coming in at the moment. I just wonder whether Bob would like to respond to some of the questions, and then we'll see whether any more questions come in before we wind up. Bob, would you like to respond to some of the questions?
Yeah, yes. I'm sorry about my camera, but maybe that's a bonus for everybody. You don't have to look at my features. But I want to say a couple of things about the struggle and the results. I would have a concern if comrades underestimate what's been achieved. I think legitimate criticism of shortcomings of current South Africa are fine. But I think we need to remember, and I'm mindful of the ANC Freedom Charter, where it talks about the people shall govern, national groups shall have equal rights, and so on, and that shall be equal before the law, enjoy human rights. So I don't think we should underestimate the scale of the victory of defeating the apartheid regime and achieving political liberation. That in no way is to minimize the shortfall in relation to economic liberation poverty and inequality. So I just think it's important that we take a balanced view on that. Secondly, the London recruits weren't just involved in what you might call civil disobedience and propaganda campaigns and all the rest of it. Yes, they were, and that was the key focus. But they also gave direct and indirect support to the armed struggle. And I think that is worth mentioning, and had allied projects that were certainly involved in that, and particularly the Africa hinterland, where they on 40 occasions took in military kit for MK in the truck. Just also to say in relation to corruption, and it is a big problem, not just in South Africa, but we've got illustrations of it right now here in Britain, haven't we? Of wheeling and dealing and the comings and goings between Tory politicians and big business and all the rest of it. So I'm not naive about that and the dangers of that. But again, I think it's important to recognise what has been achieved despite these serious shortcomings. On the question of the actual secrecy and the contact between the London recruits, I can't resist briefly describing the impact of the first couple of reunion meetings, because of course, not just Ken, but all of us had no idea who else was involved, apart from one or two immediate contacts and comrades we already knew. And I, for one, was very moved when going into South Africa House for the reunion, a building I'd stood outside of, as many of you have done, kicking off against apartheid. To go through the doors as an invited guest was quite cool. And then to look around the room and go, oh my God, she was involved. He was involved. What's he doing? It was just a very, very powerful moment, and indicated the collective effort that the London recruits was about. So I think that's important to say. And going back to the teachers' pack that Steve quite rightly mentioned, and he undersold his important contribution in steering that thing forward, I think that has enormous potential and can extend our collective efforts, because it will give us some very helpful tools, whether they're used in schools or in other community settings, then fine. But I think that will be a very valuable addition. And the last but not least, I want to ask everybody, if you've not already, forgive the advert, but if you've not already bought a copy of the book, well, bloody well go out there and buy one and read it, because the comrades' individual stories are just absolutely amazing, and you'll be uplifted by them. And that's no bad thing, because without hope and inspiration, we're in trouble. And despite all the difficulties of the current fractured politics, we need to remain hopeful and inspired by socialist principles, and carry on the fight.
Thanks, Bob, and thanks all the comrades. I'm just going to ask Ken Keeble, who was obviously very closely involved in London recruits, to maybe just have a last word and come in now. We've got no more questions. So thanks, Ken.
Well, I haven't had the pleasure of meeting Jerry Downing before. I think if I believed what he believes, I think I'd say I'm sorry I ever went to South Africa in the first place. I probably wouldn't even get out of bed in the morning, because the world is such a terrible place. So I just want to say that I don't follow the situation in South Africa all that closely, because I spend most of my time fighting for socialism in Britain. But I'm sorry we haven't got someone here from the ANC or the South African Communist Party to defend themselves against the accusation that people are, so the South African people are worse off now than they were under apartheid. I don't believe that at all. I have been to South Africa since the end of apartheid, and I really don't believe that. That's I think is all I'll say. Thank you.
Okay, well, it looks like we've had some technical problems there with Ken. Okay, well, I'd like to thank everybody. I'd like to thank our speakers. I'd like to thank Bob in particular. And we'll just remind comrades that the book is available. I think that if you maybe look on the LLA website later on, we'll have a web link where you can purchase it, but I'd recommend everybody buying it. So thanks, comrades, for your contributions. Just one reminder, we have a further LLA educational meeting tomorrow evening, and that's Tony Greenstein's last contribution on the nature of Zionism, and in particular the recent development of Zionism and the Israeli state. And that's well worth coming along to and taking part in the discussion. I'd also like to remind comrades that we've got another education session next week, and that will be on some of the recent developments in Northern Ireland. The title and the speakers and so on, details will be announced on our website, and we will be circulated within a day or so. So all it remains for me is to thank everybody for coming along, and I look forward to seeing you at some of our next meetings. Okay, so thanks, comrades, and see you again soon. Good evening.